Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Concussion Nerds podcast. And today we are joined by Lauren Auer. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi.
And Lauren is one of our guests and speakers for the Concussion Nerds Virtual Summit coming up this fall. And I'm so excited to have you on the summit, Lauren. I scoured the internet looking for speakers to join us on the summit. And everyone on this podcast knows that the people that I've invited, both on the podcast and the summit, are people who are incredibly passionate about what they do. They're leading ways in their fields. And truly, at the heart of everything is you want to help your clients. And when I was looking through social and trying to find people who I felt exuded this energy of passion and love and support, that is all I got from your Instagram page.
Well, that's
And
good to hear.
yeah, so I would love actually for you to introduce yourself a bit more to the audience and who you are and what you do.
Sure. Yeah. So I own my own private practice in Illinois. So I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. And I've been focusing primarily on trauma and trauma related modalities for all of my career. So a little bit of background, I guess, on me is I started my college experience working more in like the criminal justice side of things because I thought that's kind of the track I wanted to take. And what ended up happening with that basically was that I was seeing so much trauma underneath the criminal behavior of the clients that I was around. I was working in a juvenile detention facility for a while. And, the kids there had done terrible things, obviously, to end up in there, but they all had so much trauma. And it was just so secondary and I couldn't get past that. So I went and I got my master's degree. And then from there, I worked in agencies, really working a lot with kids that have experienced trauma as well as their family, as well as perpetrators of trauma in a therapeutic setting. And then I was working in like crisis center and responding to stuff that was happening like imminently. And then also working in a therapeutic setting with people that had experienced trauma much earlier in their lives and were just now dealing with it. And then from there, I became the director of that agency. So then at that point, I was working with, my staff that was also dealing with this vicarious trauma and the secondary trauma and this burnout. And like, it was just like I was getting trauma from like every angle, every type, every manifestation of trauma. So it was like kind of all around me. And that's really where I kind of launched my own practice, kind of taking the things that I had really kept with me from all those different settings and really focusing in on that in the work that I do now.
Oh, I
Mhm.
love that. And I love when I get to do these podcasts too. I learn more about we've had a couple of conversations at this point, but I
Mhm.
love that I get just to learn more about every single person when we do these podcasts. And thank you for sharing that. So obviously I work with persistent concussion and that's who is coming to this summit. And for me, the more I've worked with, so I've been working with persistent concussion for 7 or 8 years at this point.
Mhm.
And, for me, when I look at those individuals that are really struggling to recover, and honestly, I'm gonna say the population in general these days, there was this theme of although it's not may not have been the reason, because what happens with concussion, and I know you've worked with people with as well, but is that it
Mhm.
literally gets written off as this is all in your head. And so the reason you're
Mhm.
having all these symptoms is because it's in your head, whether it's that anxiety, whether it's your trauma, like whatever it is, like it's all in your head. You need to go deal with that. And while I
Mhm.
don't agree with that, I do believe that for many people, it is an element that needs to
Mhm.
be addressed because I do believe that trauma base and what I've seen in clients is if there is a trauma history, it can 100% be a barrier to continuing to move forward and recover. And so I guess my thought would be like, what would be your thoughts on
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think something that stood out to me and continues to stand out to me so much in the work that I've done is just like how interconnected everything is, like I think it really does a disservice to anybody to like work in these silos of like, hey, let's
that? You
let's
can't see me on this video. I promise you guys, I promise I did not prime her. I did
She
not
did
like
it.
spoon feed her. I'm just like over here cheering because yes. Oh my goodness. Sorry. I had to like cheer and just keep going. My apologies.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's so true because it's all interconnected. That's just how we work as humans, And I think if you work at with things in silos like that, it just really often perpetuates the problem. And I think that also kind of assumes that there's just like one and only thing to focus on. Like if you're just focusing on health, right? Well, sometimes like navigating the healthcare system and having to advocate for yourself and or getting bad treatment like that creates trauma too, and then like what about that, like it's just we're complex, like humans are complex and relationships are complex and everything about what we do is so complex that you really can't just like simplify it down to that. It doesn't work that way.
Oh my gosh. I love it. I love it. I just love that. Why we clicked in our first call too. I was like, met Lauren. She's like, lovely lady comes and sits on this call with this complete stranger who's messaged her on Instagram and been like, come talk to me. And I just sitting there and it's okay. Oh, I love it. I remember so when I had reached out to you, I had looked at a ton of your content and there was one of your reels. And
Mhm.
I don't remember the exact wording of it, but I was like, again, there's certain things that make me really cheer. And it was one of your reels you created about
Mhm.
how, especially when it comes to trauma, we can't just do talk therapy. And so I would, because I think when people think of counseling and when they think of therapy, or like use those changes in therapy, they think they have to go and rehash and revisit and talk about everything over and over and over again. And I feel like that's just not the case. So I would love, like, that reel is what kind of drew me into you, is like talk therapy is not enough. I would love for you to expand on that.
Yeah. Yeah. This is like I could get on a big old soapbox about it. So I'll try
Get on
not
a
to
big
go too
soapbox. Let's do it.
crazy.
Do it.
Okay. I'll get on a really big soapbox during the actual concussion summit, but I'll give you like the preview. Yeah. Because, like I said before, having worked in all these different settings with all these different manifestations and types of trauma, and, everybody's experience is so different that there was just so many patterns that stuck out to me. And I think that something I often was seeing is like this level of stuckness in talk therapy. And not just from clients that I was working with, but clients that had come to see me that had maybe done a ton of therapy already. Or when I was, managing a staff, like my staff coming to me and saying, like, man, I'm so stuck with this client. Like, I don't know what else to do. I feel like we've done everything. And so it was just this like really big frustration that just kept happening. And, you know, just the way that I think, I'm always like, okay, I want to figure out like the actual solution for it, because it does. It creates a lot of frustration, a lot of hopelessness, a lot of burnout, like all of the things. And it really ultimately comes down to like neuroscience when you're talking about this stuff, because when you're telling about an experience, when you are describing events, memories, whatever the case may be, like you're using your prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that can tell stories, that can make connections, that holds the memories, that puts logic to things. And that's wonderful. Although when we're experiencing trauma, like the prefrontal cortex isn't even lit up. Like that is so much deeper than that. Like it's more in that emotional, instinctual, like that fight, flight, freeze. Like that's a completely different region of the brain. And I think that oftentimes it's just our natural tendency to want to put logic to things and explain things. But what I was seeing over and over again is these people coming to me in therapy saying, I know why I'm petrified of flying, I know I've been in therapy and I know that it's a control thing and it goes back to that, and that there's like a trauma associated with that when I was a kid, and I've identified it and I know the reason. And yet, when I go to get on an airplane, I'm still just as panicked as ever. That's just an example. But it's that stuckness of like, okay, like the talk can only go so far. It's not unhelpful. Like it does offer some insight. It helps people maybe normalize their reactions and stop, judging themselves. There is like good stuff there, learning coping skills, all of that. It's great. But to actually experience real change and healing, you really have to engage the whole brain, and especially the parts of the brain that were lit up when the trauma was actually happening, because those instinctual parts of ourselves are going to continue lighting up until we can create like a level of safety around them. And that goes much beyond words. You know, a lot of times people will like, there's this word subcortical, which literally means without words. And I know that for so many people, if they have some sort of traumatic or difficult experience in their life, like, yeah, they could tell this story about it, but there aren't actual words that you could use that really, describe the feelings and the experience of being in that. And so that is where there's like just that limit to the talking part of it, because it doesn't actually honestly like honor the experience in the way that it needs to in order to heal.
I love the way you phrase that last part. Like, that's beautiful. And I think too, like you talked about the person that like, we know we're stuck, we know it's a control issue. But I also think, and this is just literally just me thinking out loud, like then we have those people who are getting triggered or are super reactive and having these responses and they don't understand why they're happening. And
Mhm.
it's like if all we're doing is talking about the reaction, but then we don't have the memory because we've blocked it out to help us then figure out this link to then piece like, I can only imagine, well, that was me. Honest. Like, why am
Yeah.
I so like hyper reactive? Why am I so like, why am I
Mhm.
blowing up people? Like, why can't I take feedback? Like all these pieces, I didn't have a memory to then make the logical connection. So there had to be a different
Mhm.
way to access for me to even begin to try to understand to then be able to take a step to work. Does that make sense or am I rambling a little bit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, right, because that's the other thing. If healing is dependent upon talk therapy, sorting through the memories, making those connections, putting the logic together, then what does that say for every person that, had pre-verbal trauma, that doesn't have active memory, that has medical trauma, has stuff that they will never be able to tell a story about it because their brain wasn't, activated in the same way to where they actually have memories. And also, I think another thing I see sometimes, a lot of times actually, is, you know, how I guess sometimes the reasons that are coming out through the type of modalities that I do, like the things that they are connecting, seem like either a really small or minor, or like that doesn't make any sense that we're working on, let's say, my social anxiety right now. And I'm thinking about this kind of random thing that happened when I was in third grade that, like, honestly, kind of logically wasn't that big of a deal, but that's what's coming up. It's just like we try so hard to put all this logic around things and like almost second guess ourselves or talk ourselves out of the way we're feeling or reacting or whatever. And like your brain doesn't care. Your brain doesn't care how logical it is or how much it makes sense or how important or unimportant it is. Like it doesn't care. Like that's just what your brain was doing.
So we've talked about, that scenario of like, if we can't pull it from our memory base, and so we can't make that trigger, and I know we're going to go way deeper into this in the summit, but like, how does someone then begin to discover, like, and you're talking about like, they're making these connections finally, like, so how does someone begin to go down that path to make the discovery to heal?
Well, yeah. So I specialize in a couple modalities that kind of specifically work with those deeper parts of the brain. I'm trained in EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Big mouthful. And also, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a lot. And also brain spotting, which is kind of another approach that uses that same neuroscience. And then I do a lot of like somatic integration, which is really involving the whole body, the nervous system, how our bodies react and understand things. And I bring all of that into therapy. So, as much as I can do therapy with people that gets them out of that prefrontal cortex and really into their body into where the trauma is stored and those symptoms are showing up, it's like then you're kind of speaking to the trauma in the language that it speaks, it understands. And then that's where those connections start to come from. It's amazing.
Oh, I love it. And I always like my audience knows, like I've experienced it. I've gone through a ton of EMDR in my life. I'm dealing with a trauma from a sexual assault when I was in high school, or not high school, university, and a whole bunch of other things. And, it was a huge, huge leap in my journey, like 100%. Like I don't think I would be where I am without my therapist that did EMDR, to be honest.
Mhm.
So I'm going to say the scary thing for me when I
Mhm.
refused to do therapy for a lot of years before I like took the step was because there was this piece of me that knew I needed to see somebody because I was still having some nightmares, and like I knew that there was things I needed to do. But this was my internal rationale. Life was going pretty good. Like
Mhm.
things were moving along. I was managing it. It wasn't interfering with my life. And I didn't want to mess up. It was literally my like internal mindset at the time. I didn't want to mess up what was happening in my life at that moment.
Mhm. Mhm.
I was terrified that if I opened that door to start to explore and work on like the assault that had happened, and I knew that if I'd started to work on that, I was terrified of what would happen in my world and if I would have the ability to cope and if I would lose
Mhm.
everything I worked for and if my life would be turned upside down. So
Mhm.
I didn't do it. And I kept pushing it aside and pushing it aside, even though like I knew there was this piece, literally until the point where between, and when we talk about, this is a really long-winded question, when we talk about like nervous system capacity and window of tolerance and all these pieces too, like I was staying within my window. And
Mhm.
then 2020 happened. And
Mhm.
then a lot of life happened and a lot of stress happened and a lot of other things happened. And my tolerance no longer existed. And suddenly I was having regular nightmares. I was literally having intrusive thoughts on the hour. Again,
Mhm.
I had no short-term memory. My brain fog was ridiculous. I was literally dropping the ball in every single aspect of my life, professional and business. And so I literally reached a point where it was like, Natasha, you have no choice
Mhm.
anymore. You need to do
Mhm.
something. And that's when I found my EMDR therapist. Now, I don't want other people to wait till I waited
Yeah.
to do the work. So, what would you have said to me that was before shit hit the fan? When it was me that knew there was stuff that needed to be done, but I was so scared about opening that door. What would you say to that me? Because I bet there's some people
Mhm.
that are in that same spot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a tale as old as time right there. I think especially like 2020 did it a lot of us over. And I think, it's like when you experience anything traumatic, it's at its core, it's the loss of control. And so I'm sure that leading up to that breakdown that you had, it was like, well, at least you could control that, like you could just, that was like the one thing that like my life is pretty steady. So I'm going to just keep doing this. I can control that. And that felt good. Right.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, again, being a human is complex and there will constantly be things outside of our control that happen. And if it's not now, it's later. If it wasn't the pandemic, it would have been something else. Like you would have hit that point eventually. And I think that it is really important when finding a good trauma therapist that, for the person going into it with the mindset of knowing that, like I always say, like fast is slow and slow is fast. And a therapist that especially specializes in trauma should know that. They should be very careful to not flood you, to not overwhelm you. It should be paced. Like it should, you know, if you go in there and your expectation is to have a couple sessions and dump it all out and be good to go, like that's not really how it works. And so it's an understandable fear. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes people do have negative experiences with maybe a therapist that's not a great fit for them or not, doesn't have a lot of training in that to where it could be hard. But, you were having, even before the breakdown, you were having nightmares. Like you were having, it's not like you were healed, like you knew you weren't healed.
I
You
knew
knew
it.
you weren't healed.
I knew it.
Yeah. And like,
Managing, Lauren.
yes, you were managing,
Down
but
enough that it wasn't interfering with my day to day.
exactly. But that's like holding like a beach ball underwater. Like you can do that for a while, right? But it takes a lot of effort. It takes a ton of effort. And like the second anything interrupts you, that beach ball is going to come up. It's the same thing with this stuff. And when you're having nightmares, when you're having flashbacks, when you're having memories, that is literally just your brain's way of trying to make sense of that stuff and store it away so that it can heal. So I feel like whenever that's happening, those are just signals that your body, your brain, your nervous system like wants to store that stuff and is ready to store that stuff because your brain is amazing and will protect you. Sometimes our brains protect us by completely blocking stuff out, which is great. But, those things are going to come up when you have the capacity to do so, even if you don't think that you do. And so the only way to kind of take that control back of not having nightmares, not having flashbacks, not having the negative symptoms, whatever they may be, is you can lean in a little bit to doing that work. And that is actually it's like feeding your brain what it was, which is like, let's look at this. Let's talk about this. Let's put the elephant in the room. And if you're feeding your brain that in a paced way, then it will become less and it will become less and it will become less until it feels a lot better. You feel like you're healing.
I love that. And I mean, I can speak to that process and that piece of it, right? Like when this had happened, I couldn't even talk about it. I couldn't say the words. I couldn't without that like visceral response in my body and like the fear and the shame that came around with all of it, which of course was and now to be able to have the conversations and use it as a tool and awareness to support other people is a huge piece. I think the two more questions. I think I want people to understand that obviously, and I love the like fast is slow is slow, slow is fast. In saying that, like it was 17 years later that I actually started to do the work to resolve that incident. It didn't take me 17 years to process it. And so
Right.
I want people to understand, and maybe you can speak to like, it was this long ago, so it's going to take me this long to heal. Like healing doesn't always need to be this long, drawn out process. Like I remember the exact moment that I was like, I remember the exact vision, the exact moment. It was beautiful. I cried, instant grounding and settling in my body. And I was like, we're good. It was lost 17 years. Right. And I think sometimes when people are on this journey and it's been a really long time and they're starting to have the courage to take that step to be like, okay, I'm going to look at this piece of me. And I always view it as like personal exploration. People to understand that like, yes, it takes time, but it's not a one-to-one.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, the slow is fast and fast is slow. That's about pacing within those sessions, within the day-to-day stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think that oftentimes, even just giving something like a little bit of that energy, it's amazing. It's like your brain's already kind of primed for it. I don't know. Sometimes I kind of describe starting therapy to like if you have like a closet in your house that you just throw like everything in that you don't like, I'll deal with that later. 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 And you throw it all in this closet. And then eventually, like that closet door is going to like not shut. It's going to break off. Right. And then it's kind of like you're dealing with this mess. That's like what your experience was. Right. And I think like there is function to that too, because I think there is something to be said and shouldn't be shamed about people aren't always like ready right away to go do that work, or there's other factors in their life that they're really needing to focus on, or, it's for whatever reason, their capacity during those times are small. So, that's fine. That's fine. And that happens. And that's very human. And so, I guess there's kind of two ways, right? Like if every now and then you kind of open that door of that closet and like sorted through a few things and like shut it, like, okay, eventually it would be a very slow process. Maybe if you just did a little bit here and there, but over time you get it out. Or, if the door blows off because you never look at it and then you're dealing with this mess, like sometimes it can feel really overwhelming at first. But like if you start sorting through that stuff and you start, making the piles and like, okay, this is going there and this is storage and this is like that feels good. Like the process of it actually feels good, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes a lot, but like, eventually it's done and like you did it and that's an accomplishment and it was hard. Like there's so much more good that comes from that process too, that goes even just beyond like looking at the trauma, but even like recognizing your own capacity to sit with it and like to do that work and how, you're developing different patterns for the future to where you're not just shoving it back in the closet, like all of these things play out in like such a beautiful way that, I think everybody's capacity and situation is different. And so it's really about kind of like meeting the person where they're at with that.
I love it. Final question for you for today. If someone, because I know it's going to come up after this episode, if someone is looking for a trauma therapist, what should they be looking for? So we were talking at the beginning too, Lauren and I were chatting you guys about how there's different terms in our different countries. There's different terms in different states. There's different terms in different provinces. So when people are starting to look for help, like it can be confusing as heck.
Yeah.
So, if someone is like ready to start doing that, like what should they be looking for?
Yeah. And I feel like trauma is kind of like a buzzword. I mean, like really, like everything mental health related, there's usually some element of trauma somewhere in there. So I think that most people who advertise themselves as therapists and counselors, you know, they may mention that word, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have specific training in it. And that can be really confusing. And again, it's like you're saying, like, I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. Like that's what it's called in the state that I live in. But that doesn't necessarily mean that like if you live in Wyoming or Canada, that is, what that might mean something completely different there. Maybe they don't even use that. So yeah, it can be a lot, which I always, if possible, to get personal recommendations from somebody and trust or whatever is usually a good place to start. I know that's not always possible for people. It's also like I really encourage people to come with specific questions like, have you worked with this before? What are your thoughts about this or that? Or, all of that, like asking specifically about what you're looking for to see, like, do you have specialized training in this or that? And, I think a lot of therapists they either offer like a consultation call, or you can even just go to that first session kind of under the idea that this is kind of just feeling each other out and seeing if it's a good fit. You don't just need to like commit to a person because they're a person that's available. And also, if you are working with somebody and you feel like it's not the best fit, like you don't have to stay there. Like, and that doesn't mean, oh, well, like counseling doesn't work for me or counseling is bad. It just means maybe there wasn't the best fit there. I mean, this is a person that you're likely going to be talking to, I don't know, like maybe once a week or whatever it is about really vulnerable, intimate, hard things. So, like, to mesh with them is kind of important. Like to feel like you can trust them and be able to talk with them is pretty important. And so just know that, stick to that. And as therapists, like we get that. Like if somebody's not vibing with me, I like for sure want them to go find somebody that they do vibe more with. I want to help them find that person because that is going to be really important in their healing. I'm not going to take that personally ever. I'm speaking for myself, of course, but I think a lot of people feel that way. So yeah, personal recommendations are great. Asking them questions, asking about trainings. There is like search hubs like psychologytoday.com is a big one where there's like profiles of people on there and you can kind of filter it for like the type of thing that you're wanting to work on. If you want a male or a female, if you want in person or telehealth, like So that's sometimes a good place to start, but I wouldn't end there. I would like maybe narrow it down and then find a handful of people, look through their website, look through their profile. Like if they have social media, look on theirs, kind of like get their vibe or ask for a consultation call and kind of like feel it out. I mean, a similar, like, I don't know, like I have two young kids. I didn't just go like pick some random pediatrician off the street. Like I looked at a few, I asked around, I asked like, who do you like? I got to know them, and that's a pediatrician that they see like, I don't know, now like once a year, twice a year, hopefully, like, so the stakes are like a little bit lower with that almost, some may say. But yeah, it's okay to be picky, I guess.
I love that. Thank you. Oh, I'm
Hmm.
so excited to have you part of the summit. For those listening, Lauren is talking to both our clinician track and those on a healing journey track. And she's going to be on the live panels. There's a lot of Lauren. It's going to be great. And she's going to be diving more into brain spotting and EMDR specifically in the summit as well. And like I said, I have my personal experience with EMDR, but I'm so excited to learn more about brain spotting because I just don't
Yeah.
hear about it a lot. Like it's coming up more, but I know nothing about this modality. And I get asked about it a fair bit because it's being asked, and I'm just like, I don't know. So I'm really excited to learn from you as well. So
Awesome. I'm excited.
thank you so much for being here, Lauren. If people want to reach out to you, if they want to learn more about you, about your practice, what is the best way to get to know you and reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on Instagram, and that's just at Steadfast Counseling. I'm fairly active on TikTok. I not quite as much as Instagram, but that's the same thing at Steadfast Counseling there. My website, steadfastcounseling.com. Those are probably the top ways to get to know me. All my links and stuff are all in there. So yeah.
We'll drop that in the show notes as well, too. So, oh, thank you so much for being here, Lauren. I'm so excited
Thank
that we
you.
got to do this and that people get to learn more from you. And for those of you listening, if you have not already signed up for the Concussion Nerds Virtual Summit in September, we have both free and VIP pass options for clinicians and those on a healing journey. The link is in the show notes. Come join us. It's going to be amazing. And we will see everybody next week. Have a great
Sounds
day.
good.
That's today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, give us a like, give us a share, give us a tag on Instagram, and please never hesitate to reach out. We love communicating and connecting with you. Until next week, my friends, have a marvelous day.